Dirty Politics, Hard Times, a Trilogy of Chartism, narrated by the author, Malc Cowle. Book 1, The Manchester Chartist.
Chapter 11, continued.
Who's the small dark stranger? Bess looked towards the doorway as Irene Rose grasped her arm. A familiar figure stood in the entrance looking around the room. Michael O'Donnell, she said simply. She smiled to herself, amused at the fascinated, almost dreamy expression on Rose's face. She leant over the table towards her husband. "Daniel, can they grab Michael and introduce him to Rose?" she asked, nodding towards the doorway. Daniel stood up and passed young Daniel over to carry out her instructions. He returned with the Irishman within moments. "Michael O'Donnell," he said rather stiffly, "you've met our Bess. This is her friend, Mrs. Leisure Hodgkinson, and this is Miss Irene Rose." Michael bowed slightly and said, "We meet again, Mrs. Hodgkinson." Leisure nodded and smiled. He'd attended the meeting earlier and convinced many of the faint-hearted to join the union. The Irishman turned his attention to the young woman gazing so intently at him. "Miss," he stopped in mid-track, realising Daniel hadn't mentioned her surname. The mill owner's daughter smiled up at him, seemingly intrigued. "Miss Irene Rose Heathrow," she said, "but please call me Rose, Mr. O'Donnell." Once more he bowed slightly before replying, "But that wouldn't be at all fair now, would it? If I'm to be calling you Rose, you must be calling me Michael." His Belfast brogue was softened and tinged with a Lancashire accent, but his English pronunciation was clear and free of dialect, almost as though he'd learnt English as a second language, which of course he had. Like many of the Irish in Manchester, Irish was his first language, despite his Presbyterian background. His blue eyes twinkled beneath thick dark eyebrows, and Irene Rose smiled once more. "I'm very pleased to meet you, Michael." Bess glanced across at her. Rose seemed to be impressed, if not smitten. "Sit thyself down, Michael," she said with a grin. "Please join us, it's good to see thee again." "And you too, Bess. I understand congratulations are in order. Happy birthday to you." Daniel pulled over a chair and made room for him. "Have you seen anything of your friend John Doherty?" "The big man'll be joining us shortly. He's promised to bring his fiddle and we'll be treating you all to a few jigs and meals after lunch, I'm thinking." "I haven't enjoyed myself so much in a long time," Irene Rose confided to Michael O'Donnell. "Nor I, Rose. You dance a fine jig for an English lass." Daniel, with his son crooked in one arm and Bess linking the other, walked ahead down London Road towards Hardwick. Irene Rose had insisted they should all return to her home and meet her father. Michael had impressed her, and she felt sure he'd impress her father as well. At the same time, she wanted to round off Bess's special day in the best way possible. She purchased a present for her, but hadn't wanted to embarrass her friend in front of her workmates. As they approached the house, Irene Rose was surprised to see her father approaching from the opposite direction. "Where have you been, father?" "I've been over to see Josiah West. I thought I might let him know about the possible trouble facing him in his Ancoats mill, and remind him of his duty for his employees' safety." He smiled. "Happy birthday, Bess. Are you well?" "Yes, I've had a wonderful day, Mr. Heathrow." "Father, can I introduce you to Mr. O'Donnell?" Matthew looked at the stranger, a twinkle in his eye. He stuck out his hand, recognising the union organiser. "The infamous Michael O'Donnell, I presume." "You presume right, so you do, Mr. Heathrow. I hope you've heard nothing good about me. Miss Irene Rose has been telling me all about you, and if just half of what she says is true, I'm only too pleased to be making your acquaintance, and that's the truth of it." "Do you always treat your class enemies with such charm?" Matthew replied, his old eyes smiling. "If you're an enemy, Mr. Heathrow, I wish I had more like you. I really do." Matthew shook his head. He could imagine the charming Irishman as a formidable foe, or a stalwart friend. "Come on, let's all go inside and get out of the cold. The wind's beginning to bite." They walked up the short drive through the small garden and climbed the steps to the front door. Matthew knocked, and they soon heard footsteps approaching. The door opened, and a young maid with a cheerful face stood to one side to let them in. "Good afternoon, Mr. Heathrow, Miss Rose," she greeted them. "Good afternoon, Grace. Matthew replied with a smile. "Do you think you could bring tea, please?" He ushered them all down the corridor and into his library. A roaring fire greeted them. The room was square, with a high ceiling, all the walls lined with well-stocked bookcases, save the one looking out onto the well-tended front garden and the green opposite. A polished oak table occupied centre stage, a dozen hard-backed chairs arranged around it. An oval mirror hung above the large, damp black marble fireplace. "Come on, Bess, sit yourself down, and you too, Daniel and Michael." Daniel took a seat, as did Michael and Matthew, but Bess hesitated, looking around in wonder. "I think Bess would like to peruse some of your literature, Father," Irene Rose said, linking her friend's arm. "Come on, Bess, let's see what we can find that may be of interest to you." "Miss Rose tells me that you're a supporter of the 10-hour bill, Mr. Athrow, and you refuse to employ any children under the age of 12. Can you be telling me why is that?" Michael asked the mill owner. Matthew gazed at him for a moment, a shrewd look on his face, which eventually creased into a smile. "Before I explain, I think we should all be on first-name terms, Michael. Please call me Matthew, and I have a feeling my daughter will be only too pleased if you call her Rose." He paused, and Michael nodded agreement. "My father was a devout Quaker," Matthew said. "From being a young child he taught me all men were born equal in the sight of God, and should be respected and treated accordingly. He opened Gibraltar Mill, although it was much smaller in those days, and I, like my brother George, was put to work as an apprentice at the age of 8 in exactly the same way as his mill hand's children. We were expected to undertake the same jobs as the other children, starting as scavengers, cleaning underneath the machines. Later we became duffers, stripping the full spools from the spinning mules and replacing them with empty ones. In those days, the spinning room on each floor of the mill contained about 20 machines. The spindles on each mule were apportioned to a particular child. My father's overseers had instructions to treat the children with respect and patience, but later in life I visited other mills where they enjoyed no such goodwill. In those mills, woe betide the poor child who, for whatever reason, fell behind in carrying out its allotted tasks. The machine would be set going and the child's fingers bruised, skinned and burnt with the revolving spools as it tried to catch up with his or her comrades, desperately trying to match the speed of the machine. I've witnessed overlookers beating youngsters unmercifully. I've seen them strike infants frequently, little girls as well as boys, worn out and half asleep. I've seen children struck with such force they were knocked flying off the stools on which they'd sat to steal a few moments' precious respite, hitting the hard, oily floor and sometimes falling into the whirring spinning mules with catastrophic results. He looked into the Irishman's eyes. "You know the barbaric conditions that appertain in most cotton factories as well as I do, Michael, if not better. There's more than one mill owner will face his God accused of child murder due to the cruel and wilful neglect of his workforce's well-being." "Aye," Michael replied. "If God wished to send an unrepentant sinner to the perfect hell, he'd condemn him forever to have the body of a young child, and sentence him to labour for eternity in one of those manufactories as many a mill child labours today." Matthew nodded his agreement. "Work in my father's mill was hard, but it wasn't as bad as most. None of the children were beaten, but the fact myself and my brother worked alongside them ensured we were under no illusions as to what they had to endure, and the inhumanity of it. We were also aware, as we made friends with the children of our own age and visited their homes, which my mother encouraged, just how privileged we were compared to them. A hard day's labour often wore George and me out, but we had clean beds with linen sheets and good wholesome food in a beautiful home. Our young comrades lived in hovels, which were virtually impossible to keep clean. They enjoyed a poor diet composed of tainted food and were always hungry. We had education, were waited on by maids and lacked no creature comforts, whilst our friends had nothing in the way of any real comfort, not even the comfort of their parents, who were equally worn out through overwork and reduced to wretchedness." "Yes, I know the situation all too well, Mr. Matthew," Michael responded, "but that doesn't explain why you should act in a way that is completely out of step with the actions of your peers, and many would say against your own self-interest. Now does it?" Matthew smiled, half turning in his seat. "See that mirror over there, Michael?" He nodded in the direction of the fireplace. "I look in that glass every morning, and try to see the young boy that worked in my father's mill in my own reflection. I remember those young lads and lasses I worked with all those years ago, and wonder where they are now. All too many of them will be dead, decades before their time, and they will have died of hard unremitting toil, of overwork and poor diet, and not one of them would have deserved such a fate. I'm determined my workers and their children should have a better future." "You sound like a socialist," Michael replied. "I've read the works of the utopian socialists, Saint Simon and Fourier, and I've read and indeed debated with Robert Owen, the father of English socialism and of corporativism. I've read many of John Doherty's publications. I aspire to be a socialist. I'm aware of the great advances as well as the disadvantages made by the introduction of the factory system and mechanization. I'm aware of the tremendous wealth it's produced and the possible future benefit it offers, providing it's brought under control." He paused for breath. "Today, no more than 500 people working with machinery in a mill produce the amount of wealth it would have taken over 100,000 people to produce less than a century ago. Yet the working people who produce that wealth live in poverty. It was they, in the main, who invented and produced the machinery that makes such colossal production of wealth possible, and they continue to do so. The owners of the cotton and woolen mills invent nothing and improve nothing, but employ millwrights and engineers to do so, just as they employ superintendents to manage their enterprises. Many of them never set foot in their mill, whereas the wealth whose production once sustained 120,000 people for every 500 employed today disappeared to, do you think? Into the bank accounts of people like you, Michael pointed out with a grin. Exactly, Matthew replied. He looked the union organizer in the eye. Try as I might, I can't in fair consciousness justify the situation we find ourselves in today, and that's God's honest truth. My friend John Doherty would agree with much that you say, Matthew. When he founded the Voice of the People, he wrote in the first edition, I want to better the conditions of the people, to have them stand erect and look boldly in the faces of their masters, and to tell them, we are not your slaves, we are your equals, we are one side of the bargain, you are only the other. We give you an equivalent for what we get from you, and we are therefore entitled to at least equal respect. I think he was right. At that point a knock at the door interrupted them. The door immediately opened as Grace entered bearing a tray with a teapot and china. Irene Rose walked briskly across the room to the maid's aid. Here, child, let me help. She took the tray off the girl and placed it on the table. You go and tell Cook to let you have your supper, Grace, and then you can retire to your bed if you like. I'll see to things for the rest of the evening. She looked across to her friend sat at the writing bureau, seemingly engrossed in a book. Come and join us, Bess, she said as she began to pour the tea, placing cups of the brew in front of Daniel, Michael, and then her father, before pouring one for Bess and then her own. Matthew took a sip of his before returning to his conversation with Michael. If John Doherty had only said that, I'd have accused him of being a typical moderate trade union negotiator. But he went on to say, whoever opposes the present system will be the object of attacks. I will persevere to oppose it in whatever situation I may be placed. I am so convinced of its injustice that the idea of those who create all receiving scarcely anything is so monstrous that I can never be persuaded to remain quiet as long as this system exists. He smiled at Michael, who seemed surprised to learn the mill owner was familiar with the statement. He was quite right, Matthew added. The fact is, the modern production process is essentially a social process. A cotton or woolen mill, an engineering factory, or a railway for that matter, can't function without planning and cooperation between all those involved, and I see no reason why its product, namely profit, should not be owned socially and used to benefit society as a whole. The present situation where profit becomes the private property of a privileged few who happen to have inherited capital in one form or another, be it through the chance of birth, as in my case, or in the case of people like the barber Arkwright, through the blatant theft of other people's inventions, is unjustifiable. It's a form of legalized robbery. Michael nodded whilst Daniel remained quiet, not quite believing the message his ears were delivering. Bess often made similar points to him, but the last thing he'd expected was to hear the mill owner confirming her arguments. Matthew took up his thread once more. Everybody should be required to work by hand or by brain, or preferably both, and each benefit only according to the results of their labour and productivity, with the sole exceptions of the young, the elderly, the sick and infirm, who have a right to demand help and protection from the rest. That's my considered view, Michael. Production should be organised in such a way it meets human need, instead of satisfying minority greed. We need cooperation, not competition. Bess, who'd now joined them at the table, although their conversation had not escaped her attention, glanced at her employer, blowing across the top of her cup as she did so. "Those aren't fine words, Mr. Etherow," she observed, her voice low. "But words don't fill empty bellies, do they? If they did, we'd all be eating newspapers, accepting they'd increase the 4p stamp duty on 'em if us did." Daniel looked at his wife, shocked by her intervention. Michael O'Donnell looked on in admiration, whilst Irene Rose smiled, awaiting further developments with keen anticipation. "Bess, we aren't Mr. Etherow's guests," Daniel admonished. "Nay, Daniel, Bess has every right to speak her mind," Matthew intervened. "Please make your point, Bess." "I've listened to all they've said with much interest," Bess informed him, "and I must admit I agrees with every single word." She smiled and looked on to his eyes. "But what would thee say if I were to tell thee thine operatives art about to petition for less hours and an increase in hourly wage rates?" "You want to work less hours for the same wages?" "Of course, we cannot exist on less cash." "You're quite right. I don't think you could." He took another sip of tea. "I'm surprised you've taken so long to come to this decision, Bess Ackroyd. I suggest the operatives draw up a petition with Michael's assistance. Present it to me, and we'll take it from there. I promise I won't reject it out of hand. I'm sure that together we can reach a solution." The mill owner's daughter laughed and gave her friend a mischievous look. "Make sure your demands don't suffer from the sin of false modesty, Bess," Irene Rose advised. "The time's long past for you workers to remain content with crumbs from the rich man's table. You should be after the bakery and nothing less, according to what my father's just said, and I, for one, have every confidence he speaks the truth." Chapter 12. Bess Ackroyd wrapped her shawl around her tightly as she emerged from the mill. It was Friday lunchtime and a bitterly cold day, but she was eager for news. It was now almost 4 weeks since the mill hands at Nelson Mill had presented their petition to Jacob Kennedy. Much to their surprise, the mill superintendent had treated the deputation led by Lisa Hodgkinson with courtesy, and had promised to draw it to Nathaniel West's attention that morning. Immediately after lunch, their initial optimism had been cruelly vanquished. Jacob informed them West had rejected their requests out of hand, and he dared them to do their worst, threatening to sack every one of them. Lisa informed Jacob they were leaving the mill to hold a meeting, and the likelihood was none of the operatives would be returning to work until West saw sense and met their terms. To do otherwise, she told him, would be to acquiesce in the murder of future victims, and they were not prepared to have workers' deaths on their conscience, whatever Nathaniel West's wishes. Whilst a friend spread the message amongst the rest of the workforce, Lisa had hurried into the mill basement to inform her husband the moment of decision had arrived. He'd nodded grimly at the news. "Dunna fret thyself, lass. I'll ensure there's no power to drive mill machinery until you return victorious." With that, he turned to the Crossfield twin-cylinder beam engine, which he tended, modified and improved with loving care over the past 6 years. He opened the main pressure valve, smiling to himself. It looked as though some more modifications might be required to the old engine. He began to undo the nuts fastening the boiler drain plug, as Bess Ackroyd had suggested. Leaving her husband to his work, Lisa had returned to catch up with her comrades as they filed out into Loom Street. The meeting hadn't taken long to reach its decision. The Nelson Mill operatives decided for a turnout by an overwhelming majority and vowed not to return until their demands were met in full. Bess knew Irene Rose had since informed Lisa that Nathaniel West was becoming increasingly frustrated. He'd attempted to recruit workers from as far afield as Glasgow, and some had turned up in Manchester, only to return home or to seek alternative employment in the town as soon as they were made aware of the issues at stake. At the same time, West had failed to find a millwright willing to assist him restart the mill engine. Lisa's husband had hidden the boiler plug once he'd removed it, and without that the manager couldn't provide work for anyone, friend or foe. It was obvious to anybody it was now only a matter of time before the workers returned to work victorious. Bess also knew Matthew Etherow had met his old friend Josiah West once more, and offered to find a solution that would save Nathaniel's face. But Josiah had said his son was obstinate, and determined to see the workers starve before he backed down. Nonetheless, he'd assured Matthew he would keep trying to convince Nathaniel to see sense. As Bess approached Nelson Mill, a crowd of operatives stood in the street outside the main entrance, as they'd done every day since the beginning of the turnout, whilst others covered the loading bays at the side and rear, determined to let no finished products out of the mill or any scab labour in. "Bess! Bess, love!" The spinner looked across the road, attracted by the sound of Irene Rose's voice. Her friend stood on the corner with her father and Michael O'Donnell. Bess smiled and waved a greeting. The thought crossed her mind that Irene Rose and Michael seemed to be spending a lot of time together of late. Romance was in the air, she decided. The spinner began to cross the road to join them, eager to learn if Matthew and his daughter were the bearers of good news for the Nelson Mill turnout. At that moment she heard the sound of horses' hooves clattering on the cobbles. She stopped in her tracks, turned sideways and looked up, trying to take in what she saw before her. A pale-faced rider, wielding a baton, his flaxen hair streaming out behind him, his expression a contorted mask of hate and fury, galloped around the corner on a white horse and headed straight for her, followed by some half a dozen others. Irene Rose froze in shock and horror as she witnessed Bess fling her arms up in an attempt to protect her body, and then watched as her friend went down, the slavering horse cantering over her. She heard her friend's head hit the cobbles with a sickening crack, so loud the sound of hoofs failed to drown it out. Then she was running without thought for her own safety, and kneeling down alongside her friend and mentor, whilst horses' hoofs rang out on the cobbles all around them. "Bess! Bess! Oh my God! Hang on, Bess! Stay with us for pity's sake!" Blood was streaming from Bess's left ear and gushing from a great cut in her scalp above. Her face had turned the colour of the yellowy grey winter sky, and her shallow breathing came in painful short gasps, a flying hoof having cracked her rib. She opened her dark eyes, winced, and managed to smile at Irene Rose for a fleeting moment. She struggled, as if trying to make her lips move, making every effort to speak. At last she summoned up all her remaining energy to whisper, "Tell Daniel I love him, Rose. They've killed me, and they've killed the new babby. Don't let 'em." With that, she said no more. Irene Rose slowly lifted her face to the heavens, tears streaming uncontrollably down her cheeks. The mill owner's daughter let out a great, high-pitched, piercing wail of grief, pain and anger, echoing off the mill walls. The terrible vibrating curse on Nathaniel West and the crushing evil forces of anarchy the Industrial Revolution had unleashed travelled down Loom Street in shocking rolling waves. These forces had moulded, corrupted and dehumanized all too many mill owners. They'd impoverished, killed and maimed many working men, women and children in industrial capitalism's historically brief existence, and had now taken away Irene Rose's dearest and closest friend. A wailing lament arrested the attention of all who heard it, making each and every one, in all the courts, lanes and streets around, stopped dead in their tracks in shock before she too lost consciousness. "I'm sorry, Matthew, I really am. Your friend's death is truly a tragic accident." "An accident? Bess Ackroyd's death wasn't an accident. It was cold, calculated murder, Josiah. It was your son, your Nathaniel, goddamn his soul, who carried it out." "Matthew, I know you're upset, and I sympathise, I really do, but Nathaniel didn't intend to kill anyone. You must believe that." "Your Nathaniel rode round that corner like a devil out of hell. He was wielding a 4-foot-long baton, and he was at the head of 6 drunken devils armed in the same way and determined to do the same thing. He had one thought in his head, and that was to break heads. If Michael O'Donnell hadn't been there, your operatives would have torn him to pieces, limb by limb, and I'm sure God would have forgiven them for doing so." Josiah West shook his head in despair, looking down at the table. "It's all very tragic. I will do what I can to help Mrs. Ackroyd's husband and her son." Matthew shook his head in his turn, trying to keep calm, his anger building up inside him. "Don't you dare go anywhere near Daniel Ackroyd. He'll treat any offer of help from you with contempt. You'll be lucky to escape his vengeance. If I found myself in his position, I hate to think what I might do. Your son has destroyed his life. He's taken away his wife, his childhood sweetheart, the love of his life, and he's killed his unborn child. There's nothing you or your family can do for Daniel. Nothing." He locked his eyes onto the man he once knew as a good friend. "There's only one thing you can do now, Josiah. You can ensure your mill hands are treated with respect. Give your operatives what they want. It's little enough they're asking for, God only knows. Or are you willing to see more of your workers maimed and killed? Contact Michael O'Donnell straight away, I beg of you. Tell him the workers can return to work, and you will pay them for the time they've lost." He gazed at his friend, imploring him with his eyes to see sense. "If you do that, Josiah, you can begin to make some sort of amends. It's the only way open to you. You must dedicate your life to their welfare. That's what Bess Ackroyd would want, and it's what you owe her. Make sure her death wasn't in vain. Do it for God's sake and your soul's salvation." Josiah looked lost and bewildered. Matthew stood up, a look of disgust on his face. "There's nothing more I can say to you, Josiah. You're a great disappointment to me. I'll say good days to you and leave you with your conscience, assuming you still have one. You'll have your God to answer to soon enough." With that he picked up his hat and turned to go. "Nay, stay, Matthew, don't leave me here alone." Matthew turned towards him once more, hope replacing anger and despair. The old man seemed to be utterly downcast. Eventually Josiah nodded. "Yes, I'll do it, Matthew. You're right, I'll do as you ask. I'll take personal control of the mill from now on, as God is my witness. I'll try my best to make amends. It should never have come to this." "That's more like it. Now you're seeing sense, Josiah. I'll help you, old friend. This is what we'll do." Once Michael O'Donnell had managed to calm the operatives, persuading them not to lower themselves to Nathaniel's level, and to call the police instead, he'd arranged for an ambulance for Bess's corpse, and then he carried Irene Rose to Mary Upton's cottage. Mary had managed to revive her, and the mill owner's daughter now sat pale-faced at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of sweet tea, comforted by Amy Redbank. "You need to be getting Rose home soon, Michael. The lass is in shock and will be for some time. Do you know where Daniel is, Mary?" "Nay, I don't, lad, but he'll be here to see young Daniel sooner than later, I'll be bound. I don't know how I'm going to explain what's happened. We'll wait here for him, and then we'll take him and young Daniel around to my father's house," Irene Rose suddenly said, a voice barely above a whisper. "Poor Daniel's going to be devastated. I must remain here to comfort him. I want him and young Daniel to stay with father and myself, at least for the immediate future, and for as long as Daniel's comfortable with us." She looked at the man she'd fallen in love with, and the woman who'd helped bring her into the world. "We have the room, and I owe it to Bess. I mustn't let her down. Young Daniel must have a proper childhood and a decent education." Chapter 13. "That was a wonderful memorial meeting for Bess," Matthew said to Daniel. "Her friends all paid tribute to her. There must have been more than 300 people present at Mary's, and more on the street outside. You must be so proud of her. She made an important impact on a lot of people in her own modest way." Matthew and Daniel had just returned to the mill owner's house in Hardwick. Daniel glanced at Matthew. "I don't know how to thank you, Miss Rose, Mr. Heathrow," he responded. "You've been kindness itself, and I'm grateful more than words can say." "Come, Daniel, Rose and I don't need thanks. We need to see you get on with your life, and we need to see young Daniel flourish. That's what Bess would want. That will be sufficient reward for Rose and me. Above all, we have to keep Bess's memory alive and try to continue what she set out to do." It was now January 1839. They buried Bess in the December with a quiet, simple ceremony, attended only by Daniel, Irene Rose, Michael O'Donnell, Matthew, Mary Upton, Clara and Charlotte. Michael and the mill owner had arranged the memorial service so Bess's friends could celebrate her life and remember the mill worker and the many achievements she'd made in her all too short life. The dispute at the Nelson Mill had ended in victory for the mill operatives within hours of Bess's death, Josiah having taken control of the mill as he promised Matthew he would. In her address to the memorial meeting, Irene Rose had spoken about the Bess Ackroyd she had known. She spoke of Bess's hopes and aspirations for a brighter future for all working people, a future Bess knew could only be achieved if they all worked and fought together, if they educated themselves so they understood the economic and political forces arrayed against them and organised to combat them accordingly. The advancement of each and every worker to be achieved by the advancement of all. She talked about the quiet way Bess provoked discussion, provided quiet, unpretentious leadership, and encouraged people to come together, gradually building their confidence one step at a time, convincing them through their own experiences they could bring about progressive change. She detailed the way the young woman had influenced her life and thereby converted a privileged and cosseted mill owner's daughter to Chartism and the workers' cause. Irene Rose then revealed they'd found a document in Bess's dress pocket following her death, a draft petition outlining proposals for a 10-hour day. She explained Bess had prepared the petition with Michael O'Donnell and had intended to put it before a meeting of the Gibraltar Mill operatives on the day of her murder for their consideration, amendment and approval. She read the document out. It proposed the operatives should be employed from 6:30 until 12 noon, with a half-hour break for breakfast at 8:15. They should have 1 hour for lunch and finish work at 6:30, having had a half-hour break at 3:15. On Saturdays, the working hours would be the same, save they'd finish work at 1 instead of 12, but have the rest of the day off. The hourly rate of pay would be adjusted, so the weekly wage remained the same. Children from 12 until their 15th birthday would only be required to work 6 hours a day and spend the remaining 4 hours receiving education, paid for by their employer. Their weekly wage would also be maintained. Irene Rose then explained she'd spoken to her father and he'd agreed to implement these proposals in 2 weeks' time. The working hours would be placed in the mill entrance for all to see, alongside a dedication to Bess, the anniversary of whose death will be remembered with a paid holiday. Understandably, these announcements had been greeted with wonder and delight. Matthew looked up as his daughter approached, her arm linked in Michael O'Donnell's. Daniel stood up to greet them. "Michael, Rose, I'd like to thank you both. The things you said about my Bess were wonderful. She'd have been so proud and pleased to know how her friends regarded her." Rose put her arms around him and kissed him on the cheek. "Bess was the most wonderful woman I ever met, Daniel. She changed my outlook on life. She opened my eyes. She's my guide and source of inspiration, and always will be." She took him by the crook of his arm. "Come on, sit down. I have something for you." He did as she asked. She took a small leather-bound book out of her purse as her father and Michael looked on. "It's a book of Shelley's poetry," she explained. "I gave it to Bess for her birthday. She had it in her hand when she was killed. I think you should have it and treasure it in her memory, Daniel. Pass it on to young Daniel when it's time to tell him about his mother." He opened the cover and examined the inscription written in a neat hand. The message read, "To my dearest Bess, the Manchester Chartist, on your 19th birthday, from a loving sister, to whom you have been an amazing source of enlightenment and an inspiration to action. All my love, your friend and comrade in arms, always, Rose Etherell." Daniel closed the volume and shook his head. "I think you should keep boot, Rose. You're Chartist now. Maybe you could keep it safe for our Daniel when he's older. You're the one who knows Bessie's wishes in that regard better than any of us here, and you're the one to lead struggle forward best of all of us." Irene Rose smiled. "I'm not sure about that, Daniel. I'll try my best, but I'm going to need a lot of help, and that's a fact." She took the Irishman's hand affectionately in hers and turned to her father. "I've requested Michael make me his wife, father, and he's consented," she said simply. "I'd be obliged if you give us your blessing. I need a working man of Michael's capacity to keep me on the right path if I'm going to come anywhere near meeting Daniel's expectations, and, I suspect, yours as well. If there's one thing I've learnt over the past few months working with Bess, it's that the rich and powerful view working people with utter contempt, and they'll never allow them the vote or to take their rightful place in society without a long, hard struggle. We need the 6 demands of the Charter. For working people, it's a bread and butter issue, the means to win a future that isn't based on bare subsistence, but where decent homes, adequate fuel, good sustaining nourishment and leisure are regarded as everybody's right and not those of a privileged few. The freedom to starve is no freedom at all." She smiled at her father and friends. "Universal suffrage, and through it a hand on the levers of political power, are the means whereby the oppressed majority can regain their dignity as members of the human family, the means to control and make governments and conquer blind anarchic economic forces, the means to make a better world where love, compassion, solidarity, mutual respect, and a common sense of humanity and purpose count for more than the personal selfish acquisition of wealth and power over others. Working men will have the Charter, we women will have it, and I intend to play my part no matter how long it might take."